The origin and identity of the Nephilim is something that humans all around the world have debated for decades. But in recent times, this debate has been more about pushing dehumanizing propaganda onto different groups of people, rather than righteous sound doctrine from the scriptures. As historically white supremacists have pushed the serpent seed doctrine, which says that Cain was the result of Eve having intercourse with Satan, and that black people are descendants of Cain, meaning that black people are fallen seed. But however, this doctrine is false and debunked by Scripture. But this doctrine isn't the only teaching that tries to link a whole race of people as being Nephilim. Because in recent times, many blacks have started pushing the doctrine that the barbarian cavemen that evolutionists call Neanderthals were actually Nephilim monkey hybrids who are the father of the Caucasians. They then follow this up by comparing Caucasian features to that of monkeys, and using fake evidence to paint Caucasians like some kind of strange anime characters who grow tails and want to keep it secret so nobody finds out that they're actually monkeys. Of course, this doctrine doesn't hold water for many reasons that we will see today.
Okay, before we get started diving into the Nephilim and exposing the truth about them, we first have to cover the two main false doctrines about the Nephilim, and that is the black people Cain serpent seed doctrine and the Caucasian Neanderthal doctrine. Now, we're going to knock out the Cain serpent seed doctrine real quick. It's literally only going to take a couple seconds. I mean, we might only even need to read one verse. It's literally that easy to debunk. So let's get started. In Genesis chapter 4. Genesis chapter 4 and verse 1. And Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and bare Cain, and said, I have gotten a man from the Lord. Okay, that's already debunked it. So, right here, we see that Satan is not mentioned anywhere. Nowhere in the scriptures does it say that Eve was impregnated by Satan and Cain was a Nephilim offspring. And this scripture literally debunks it. Let's read it again. And Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and bare Cain and said, I have gotten a man from the Lord. Why would Eve say she's gotten a man from the Lord if she really got a man from Satan in the garden? You see, it makes no sense. Cain was a human, the son of Adam and Eve. Nowhere is Satan mentioned. And why would she even say, I've gotten a man from the Lord if this was a Nephilim? You see? And there's also some other holes in this doctrine. Like I said, this is one that's very easy to just blow up. It's not even that hard. Is the fact that in the beginning, Cain actually served the Most High Yah. Now, obviously, he turned evil, but the fact of the matter was, in the very beginning, he served the Most High Yah. Now, the reason why this is important is because, as I've mentioned in past lessons, demons can't serve the Most High Yah. They don't want to, they never have in Scripture, and they never will. All right? And we've already talked about in past lessons that Nephilim are demons. So, if you're a Nephilim, you're incapable of loving the Most High Yah and keeping his commandments and his righteous principles. So if we see someone who's keeping the law and is in Yah's covenant, we can automatically eliminate the idea of them being Nephilim. So we can do that with Cain, because he was serving Yah in the beginning. Another thing I would like to bring out is the fact that in the beginning, Yahuwah actually spoke to Cain. I've never seen any instance in Scripture where Yahuwah has had dealings with Nephilim. He never has, because they're demons. He has no time for them. They can't have salvation, and they don't serve him. They can't, and they don't. So this doctrine is easily debunked. Another thing I'd like to bring up is this took place before Shem, Ham, and Japhet. The black man, well, the black man is kind of a flawed term, because in recent times, the sons and daughters of Japhet have just tried to make black mean anybody who's melanated, but according to the scriptures, that's not true. But the so-called black man is a descendant of Shem and Ham. The Shemites are where the Negroes come from, and the Africans come from Ham. No evidence in scripture or in history or in DNA ever shows that the Negroes or the Africans come from Cain. All of the people on the face of the earth are the descendants of Noah's 3 sons, not descendants of Cain. Cain didn't have a nation and have people come from him to populate the earth. So it's already debunked in a million ways. Now, let's move on. Alrighty, now we're going to be covering the Neanderthals now. We're going to start off with breaking down these 10 holes in the doctrine that states that the Neanderthals are the Nephilim from scripture. And we're also going to break down some other things a little bit later. One of the things we're going to take a look at later on is the fact that it has been exposed that the Neanderthal remains have actually been tampered with to make them look less human, to push the doctrine of evolution. But we're going to cover that later on. Let's get started with number one. Number one, Neanderthal DNA is 99.7% identical to humans. So already this is a huge hole in this doctrine, because keep in mind, we learn in the scriptures that the fallen angels mixed with the animals and created these animal hybrids. That's how we get, the sirens, or what people call mermaids, and then we have the giants. So the Nephilim are only half human. But 99.7% shows us that the Neanderthals are 100% human without a doubt. Without a doubt. Because 99.7% of the DNA being identical to humans is too high of a percentage for them to be Nephilim. That's practically 100%. So already the DNA is not showing us any traces of Nephilim activity. Because, like I've already mentioned, 99.7% is too high of a number of them being close to humans for them not to be human. Now let's go to number two. Neanderthals had 46 chromosomes like humans. So once again, the DNA is very similar, almost 100% the same. So the Neanderthals had 46 chromosomes, just like humans have 46 chromosomes. Now, we don't have any DNA to see how many chromosomes, the sirens or the giants would have, but I reckon it would be something way different than what your average human has, because keep in mind, they're only 50% human. The other 50% is demon. So already we have the 99.7% of them being identical to that of humans with their DNA, and now we see that they have the same number of chromosomes as humans as well. So we get down to number three now, and we learn that their skeleton build or their body build is 99.8% similar to humans. They have all of the same bones that humans have. All of them are accounted for, and they all serve the same purpose. Contrary to internet propaganda, the Neanderthals didn't have any horns or tails or any other Nephilim-like features. So between the DNA, the chromosomes, and the skeleton, this doctrine is getting blown out the water. Now let's go to number five. I'm just realizing an error in this chart. I'm not sure why it goes from 3 to 5. That's a mistake I made, but we'll just roll with it. Okay, now we're going to talk about height. The tallest Neanderthal was only 5'10", not a giant. This is a problem too, because the scripture tells us about the Nephilim giants, but the Neanderthals do not fit the description of the Nephilim giants whatsoever, because the tallest Neanderthal ever recorded was only 5'10", and the average was 5'5". So between these top holes we've already covered, this doctrine is not making any sense. Now let's go down to number 6. The Neanderthals had 5 fingers and 5 toes, like humans. This is important because in the book of 2 Samuel, it tells us how some of the Nephilim had 6 fingers and 6 toes, but the Neanderthals have hands and feet that are identical to that of humans. So once again, the Neanderthals are lacking a very key trait of the fallen seed. So let's go down to 7. 7. Neanderthals lack tails or any animal hybrid features. Yeah, we kind of already covered that a little bit a moment ago, but that is true. When you look at the remains of Neanderthals, you do not see any giant. They're not giants. They're not sirens. They're not mixed with beasts. You do not see any animal hybrid features. Number 8. This is a big one. Before evolution, people believed Neanderthals were just humans who were deformed or had a disease. So the people of ancient times, the people of old, believed that the Neanderthals were just humans who were deformed or had a disease. This is important to understand the timeline. So the whole idea that they're a different species and that they're, the missing link and, before humans and all that type of stuff, that was something that was pushed when the evolutionists came onto the scene. Before the evolutionists came onto the scene, nobody saw these remains and thought that there was something other than human, all right? So that's something very interesting to know. Number 9, it has been exposed that Neanderthal remains have been tampered with to make them look more ape-like. Yes, we've covered that as well. We're going to cover that later on. We've mentioned that. And number 10, there's millions of people who are in Yah's covenant who evolutionists claim have Neanderthal DNA. Okay, you may be wondering why this is on here. I'm going to elaborate. So, with the doctrine that says that the Neanderthals are the Nephilim, that means that anybody who has Neanderthal DNA has demon DNA. They're part demon. They're a demon, all right, basically. And why this is important to know is because throughout Scripture, Yah does not deal with demons. He does not talk with demons. He does not befriend demons. And most importantly, throughout Scripture, there's never been an instance of a demon loving Yahuwah and taking hold of his covenant. But the sons and daughters of Japhet, the Europeans, who many like to mention have Neanderthal DNA, according to these evolutionist scientists, are people who have huge numbers of individuals in Yah's covenant. So for you to say that they are Nephilim demons, you're saying that demons are capable of loving the Most High Yah, which is something that has never happened in Scripture. Okay? A demon is incapable of loving the Most High Yah. And you also are trying to make the Most High Yah flawed because you are painting the picture or the idea that what Yah tells people they must do to come into his covenant is something that a demon can do. It's kind of like when you are becoming a lifeguard. They have a swim test. And on that swim test, only a certain level of swimmer will be able to pass that test. So Yah has a test of what humans must do to come into his covenant. So you're saying that Yah's test is something that a demon could pass. Kind of like saying that the Coast Guard swim test is something that somebody who doesn't know how to swim could pass. You see? So then it starts to become very blasphemous. So what we've learned here is, number 1, the DNA is 99.7% similar. I mean, not similar, identical, in fact. The chromosome numbers are the same. The skeleton build is 99% the same. The tallest Neanderthal was only 5'10". Neanderthals' hands and feet are identical to that of humans. They lacked tails and any animal hybrid features. Humans, before evolutionists came on the scene, believed that they were just diseased or deformed humans. Also, that Neanderthal remains have been tampered with by individuals to support their agenda, and that there's millions of people who are in Yah's covenant who these same evolutionists claim have Neanderthal DNA. Now, let's move on to some other stuff. Okay, I'm going to interrupt here and bring up something very important that really puts another hole in this doctrine and supports the fact that these were just ancient humans and that they had nothing to do with the Nephilim or any monkey. Here's the thing. So, people always like to talk about the Neanderthal, the European Neanderthal. And many Israelites actually use Neanderthals as like an insult towards the sons and daughters of Japhet. Oh, you're a Neanderthal. You're a monkey. That type of stuff. But here's the thing. Remains, just like Neanderthals, of these ancient humans have been found on every continent. And the Neanderthals are not just European. There's actually an Asian Neanderthal that is genetically that's ethnically genetically different from the European Neanderthal that's found in Asia. All right. There's also a black African so-called version of Neanderthal that evolutionists have given a different name that is in Africa that is once again genetically distanced from the European one. And now there's also a Middle Eastern Neanderthal that's genetically different. So all Neanderthals are not the same. They're all thrown under this name. But it's really starting to look just like humans today, where you can dig up a skeleton in Europe, a skeleton in South Korea, a skeleton in Nigeria, and then a skeleton in Palestine. And they are all going to have similar features, but the DNA is going to be different because they're not the same ethnicity, they're not the same nation, different places, etc. So that's something that I learned recently that we're going to look into a bit later. I'll put it up on the screen just right now instead of dealing with it later. That there's actually diversity of Neanderthals. All right. This is not just a Europe, Caucasus Mountains thing. All right. A lot of people like to act like that. but Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. So it really, begs the question, what if these remains are just simply what humans looked like back in ancient times when we used to live to be like 700 years old? Because people forget, during the time of the Bible, people used to live to be like 800. And now an old person is like 119. So what are these old, decrepit, thick-boned skeletons that are being found on every continent? It really starts to beg the question. Found in Africa, found in Europe, found in Asia, and found in the Middle East. And every single one of them does not fit the description of the Nephilim.
Lots of information out there.
There's a couple other skulls that I saw that were tampered with. One of them was Le Moustier, which came from France. It's called Le Moustier number 1. It's supposed to be a teenage Neanderthal. Again, the type specimen. But I saw this, and I x-rayed it and worked with it in Berlin, East Berlin, actually.
Now, Dr. Webb, we don't have to know how to pronounce these names, do we?
No, you don't.
No, okay.
Anyway, this skull had the upper jaw moved 30 millimeters forward in the skull, and the lower jaw moved 30 millimeters forward, and in between, a lot of plastic material, similar to that stuff I talked about, the hot dental compound, a lot of plastic compound squeezed in this skull to give it an ape-like appearance. So we're talking about quite a distance of movement of these jaws. So when I saw this, I was able to take the skull, and it came in pieces, actually, as we found in the pieces, put them back normally together, and take x-rays of them, and reconstruct the skull, look very much like a modern teenager. However, what we did discover was this teenager was in his late 20s, perhaps early 30s.
Now, if you think this is just an isolated case, folks,
Okay, we're now going to be getting into Enoch chapter 19. Now, what we're going to be discovering in this lesson is that the Nephilim are actually so-called racially diverse, because there's a false doctrine that's pushed out there that every single Nephilim looks like the so-called white man. But what we're going to realize is that depending on where you go around the world, the Nephilim actually resemble the people in that land. That there's swarthy African Nephilim and that there's Asian Nephilim. And we're going to be explaining this using the sirens, or what people commonly like to call mermaids. So let's start reading in Enoch chapter 19. And Uriel said to me, "Here shall the angels who have connected themselves with women and their spirits, assuming many different forms, are defiling mankind, and shall lead them astray into sacrificing to demons as gods. Here shall they stand to the day of judgment, in which they shall be judged till they are made an end of. And the women also of the angels who went astray shall become sirens. And I, Enoch, alone saw the vision, the ends of all things, and no man shall see as I have seen." Okay, so it says that the women that these fallen angels jumped became sirens. Now let's take a look at some ancient depictions of sirens from different cultures. And we're going to see that sirens, or aka mermaids, are depicted in every culture. And the way they depict them, they resemble the people of the land. Okay, let's look into it. Here is an old sketch that I found a while ago from Japan of a siren that has been washed up onto this man's fishing boat. And when you look at the features of this siren, you will realize that she has the Asian features. She has the Asian eyes. You see? So this is something that's very interesting and some very food for thought, because we are seeing that this siren in Asia resembles a Japanese woman and not a Caucasian woman. And we have another instance of this, another old Japanese sketch right here. So you see the fish body, no legs, the fish body, and look at the face. You see? So these people around the world who are depicting these demons are depicting them with different so-called racial features. And now we're going to look at the so-called black Nephilim. So I believe this is a painting of Mama Wata. So in Africa, there's a lot of ancient folklore about different sirens, all right? And they depict these sirens as being melanated, some of them with even froze, like we see right now with Mama Wata. And we're going to get into this a little bit later, more of the African folklore of it. But I just want to show you that being Nephilim is not about being white. Now, there are white Nephilim, don't get me wrong. We're going to look at that too. But what we're seeing here is that being white does not make you a Nephilim, and that every Nephilim is not a Caucasian. And we're going to look over here. We have this little idol right here, this little stand idol. And as you can see, it's depicting a siren. You see she got no legs. See her fishtail on her back. Look. See her wearing, these braids, the dark skin. You see the lips, the flat nostrils. So when you start to go around the world, you start to see that the sirens take on the appearance of the people of the land. So the idea that every single Nephilim is pale-skinned is not accurate, because a lot of guys like to run with the verse in Enoch where it says that Noah's father thought that he might be son of the Watchers because he was pale-skinned. But that was never the be-all, end-all, though, because Noah himself was what we would call fair-skinned today, and he was completely human. There were also many other albinos as well as lepers in the scriptures that we would describe as fair-skinned today, who had no connection to the fallen angels whatsoever. And not only that, but we're now seeing that not every single Nephilim is pale anyway. Now let's look at some of the white Nephilim, so let's get that out the way. Here we have a depiction of another siren. This one is from Europe, I believe, and as you can see, we have these Caucasian features. You have the nose, the face, the hair, the whole 9 yards. So in just a couple minutes, we have seen different so-called races of Nephilim demons across the world. And that's something that's very important to understand, because as it says in the intro, people have given up on trying to identify the Nephilim legitly for quite some time, and they just use it as a tool of propaganda, But in today's lesson, we're going to be destroying all that propaganda, and we're going to be showing how you can't find a Nephilim or identify someone as Nephilim based on their so-called race. It's just old Ku Klux Klan, Elijah Muhammad doctrine. It's not based in scripture or historical fact. Now I'd like to interrupt once again, because I like to talk about some more about white skin. So a lot of people who teach this doctrine are like, the Caucasians, the devil. They're devils. They're literal demons, because of the white skin. The white skin is of the devil. You hear that type of stuff. But here's one thing that destroys that very quickly. So if the Neanderthals were the Nephilim, which you've already seen through all the stuff we discovered, makes absolutely no sense and does not line up whatsoever. But if that was the case, and the Europeans, sons and daughters of Japhet, mixed with the Neanderthals, who you say are the Nephilim demons, to get their white skin, why is it today that not all Caucasians are pale, and some of them are actually pretty swarthy? Because remember, we've covered on the channel before that not every Caucasian looks like Steve Rogers. You have Caucasians in Mexico and India and Pakistan who are blacker in color than some American black people. So if the Caucasian mixed the devil to become white, how come all of them aren't white? You see, it makes no sense. So I would conclude this lesson right here, because the logical, scripture-based, truthful conclusion is that the Neanderthals and other so-called primitive man of at least that's what the evolutionists call us, are just ancient remains of humans from long ago. But I know there are people who be asking, you have not covered the wild man. Actually, I have covered the wild man in a separate video, but I'll just edit that in here, because a lot of people like to talk about those hairy giants from Europe, the wild man. And they like to not only say that is the father of the Caucasoid peoples, but they like to call him Esau. So the wild man are not the Hebrew Edomites. The Hebrew Edomites are Negroes, and they're genetically connected to Jacob. They're not Caucasoid people. Furthermore, the wild man, not saying that the barbarian period of the European never happened, as I mentioned in that lesson, but the majority of the depictions of the wild man are Caucasoid variants of the Nephilim. They're not regular white people, because when you look at them, they have Nephilim traits, something that your average white person or even the Neanderthals don't even have. Another thing people be like, you've avoided the tails. How come you're not talking that white people are born with tails? And, that's the monkey link. Why are you not talking about that? Well, I've covered it many times, but I guess I'll talk about it again. So let's go take a look. Okay, so now we're looking at this post. So this is a post that I've seen for a while now. And this is a perfect example of what I was saying in the intro, where people have long since given up trying to properly identify who the Nephilim are truthfully, and they just resort to doing propaganda. Now, when you make propaganda or you work for the propaganda department, your mission or your job is not to seek truth. Your job is to try and destroy and dehumanize the opposition. And this is exactly what this is. So it says, did you know that 35% of Caucasians are born with tails? I don't know where he got 35% from, but, let's let him continue. This is why my Adrius Netcher page get 30-day bans. Now, here's one thing I like to say. I've heard countless stories of Israelites who've come forward and exposed the Esau's the white man doctrine as false and have had their entire channel terminated. So if the J-Fights wanted to shut you up, they wouldn't give you a 30-day ban. They would take your whole darn channel down. All right, I've seen it. When the white man, aka Sons and Daughters of Japhet, want you to shut up, they take your whole channel down. They don't play with these 30-day bans. Like I said, so many people who have come forward and expose, the Esau's the white man doctrine is not a true doctrine and as a devil doctrine, have had their whole channel deleted and have since disappeared off the internet. Some have never returned. All right. So let's just get that out there. If the white man wants you quiet, he would delete your channel. He wouldn't give you a 30-day ban. Because when you have a 30-day ban, if I remember correctly, your page is still viewable to the public. You just can't post. So people would still be reading your information. They wouldn't want that if they were trying to shut you up. They ain't heard a black, spelt wrong, king exposed their history like this in 3,500 years. A random number, but they call us monkeys. So, before I move on, a bit of context about this, it's I have a dad who grew up in the Jim Crow era, so I kind of, understand, why this type of stuff is happening. But a lot of Israelites get a kick out of looking down at white people like monkeys, because one of the things that, in Jim Crow era propaganda, that the Japhet Europeans used to do to us is compare us to monkeys. So they like to do the Uno reverse card and make white people monkeys. All right. But literally the scripture says, do not envy your oppressor. And that's not saying if your oppressor, well, if the man who works at Burger King likes Jell-O, I don't mean that you can't eat Jell-O, because contrary to popular belief, the 16-year-old Burger King worker who spends his entire day picking his nose and watching TikTok memes is not my oppressor. Every single so-called white man is not my oppressor. But basically, we have sinned and have mimicked their oppressor because we're doing the same dehumanizing stuff they've done. But now let's break it down. So the white woman in the middle with the jeans on and the tail and, underwear showing and everything else. This is a digitally manipulated image that comes from a website called Divine Art. And it was made by a man who makes morph art in 2004. So it's an old photo and it's fake. So for those who don't know what morph art, it's this weird community, which is actually, against the Bible, of people who like doing bestiality and mixing animal parts with human parts, like werewolves and all that, I don't even know, anime stuff. So that's where this is from. So already one of his sources is fake. Now, the bottom baby on the right is from a fictional TV show called X-Files. So that's fake as well. Now, the second baby from the right is a stock image from Albany or Albany.com, where the creator of the poster of the image literally put digitally manipulated image in his description. So far, 3 of his sources are fake. Now talking about the white man near the bottom. So I already mentioned the tail thing. I think it was in the intro to the Japhet, the true father of the Caucasoid peoples lesson. But this has nothing to do with monkey DNA or being a monkey, all right? Because for one thing, these so-called vegetable tails, which is what the evolutionists call them, really only fit their name and they happen to be in the right spot, because sometimes these things will grow in areas where a tail wouldn't be found. So it doesn't even match. Furthermore, these tails don't lack vertebrae. They're not attached to the skeleton or have any bones like an animal tail would have. And also the idea that these are Caucasian-only mutations, birth defects, is also false, because I've seen a Brazilian Negro with one, but I ain't gonna post somebody's private photos, to prove a point like these people would. So, got nothing to do with monkey. And as for the top image on the top of the baby, I'm pretty sure I think I've seen that image before when researching this tail thing before. And I'm pretty sure that was a Chinese baby. So this is just completely debunked, and it just goes back to, it's a shame that nobody's interested in truth anymore, and it's just about propaganda. And I can tell you, I can't wait for the kingdom age when all of the righteous people of all nations are who's left, and we don't have to deal with this type of stuff no more. Okay, we are now going to be breaking down some of these ancient depictions of the wild men. Now, I have come to the conclusion that there's two different types of wild man. There is simple Japhetic barbarian wild man, and then there's Nephilim offspring wild man. Because as we've learned in the past, the book of Enoch talks about that the fallen angels polluted the animals and mixed with all these different animals and made all these different hybrids. That's how we got the sirens, and other animals were included in this. So looking at the first depiction of the wild man, we can automatically see this is not a white man. Look. He has cow ears. And you see his hands, they look like claws. So he has these bird claw-like hands. And he has the same type of ears that a cow or a goat would have. So right off the bat, we're seeing that this thing right here is clearly not a human. This is not your so-called white man. This is a Nephilim hybrid, because no human has animal ears and these claws right here. Now we're going to move on to another one, which is going to bring this point home that I'm trying to push here even more forward, that is, about there being Nephilim type of stuff going on with the wild man. Because right here, see these royal soldiers? This is your white man, Japhet, the Caucasian. These are humans, white people. But you go over here and look at the wild man, and they have horns. See the horns going out their head? So right off the bat, we're seeing Nephilim hybrid-like traits, not human traits. And we can automatically compare, if we compare the white knights to the wild man, we see those Nephilim features, horns. Okay? I'm going to elaborate a bit more on the Nephilim a little bit later, but let's keep looking at some of these depictions. Okay, this one is very, very deep right here. So right here, we have a depiction of the wild man, and he looks like Bigfoot. Okay? This looks like what we learn about in the scriptures about the giants, the descendants of the fallen angels, the giants. This thing is a hairy giant. Look how much bigger it is than the human man right here. And once again, look at the features of this man who's staring at this huge giant. He has Caucasoid features. See the straight hair? So we have a white man who is looking at a wild man. So in these depictions, we're seeing a difference. We're seeing a separation between the Caucasian and the wild man. So between that and the horns and the goat ears and the claws, we're seeing that the wild man is not only not the white man, but he is also not Esau. Here's another depiction of the wild man, and once again, we have a Caucasian knight on a horse right here, and then the wild man on the left. Now, I'm somebody who's actually done horseback riding before, and I can tell you how high off the ground you are when you're riding a horse. But look at this. The wild man is just as tall as the knight is on the horse. This thing is a giant right here. But once again, we're seeing the difference between the European and the wild man. So the people who were making these depictions were clearly making a difference between the so-called white man and this wild man right here. this Bigfoot creature. So it really starts to make you think and have some food for thought on where the origin of all these Bigfoot-like creatures come from, like Finding Bigfoot and all those TV shows. Is it possible that the wild man is the inspiration for all these legends about Bigfoot? Here's another one of these wild giants. Look, he's carrying an entire tree, and he has a man tied to the tree. And look, white skin on the hands. So once again, we're seeing the difference. We automatically know this man's a giant based on the fact that he's carrying an entire tree with a whole man tied to the tree. Another thing I find interesting is the fact that he has green body hair. Like, where have we seen that before? Very interesting. So, right off the bat, we're seeing with these ancient depictions, we're seeing Nephilim-like mutations with these creatures.